Happy holidays, feral friends and fellow nature nerds. I hope you're enjoying whatever holiday it is that you choose to celebrate this time of year. Now, since the holidays are a busy time and this episode is being released on Christmas Day, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to give you the gift of the lost episode of the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So first, some history. Way back in 2019, I got a job at Fontenelle Forest Nature Center in Bellevue, Nebraska. Now, this was my first introduction to interpretive nature programs and what would eventually launch Dispatches from the Forest, both as a business and a podcast. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So, of course, we all know what happened in 2020. And since my job at the forest was providing interpretive nature programs, primarily at assisted living facilities, mine were among the first programs to start getting canceled as those facilities went into lockdown amidst the pandemic. But a few months later, early summer of 2020, my wife got transferred to Washington, D.C., and we moved to Virginia. Now, Fontenelle Forest did their best to keep me employed, even from a distance. I can legitimately claim that I was an early adopter of Zoom, and I continued to provide virtual programs for Fontenelle Forest during that time. So one of the things that was proposed as a way to keep me employed, as well as providing the forest with some added value, was a podcast. But ultimately, Fontenelle Forest decided that a podcast wasn't something they wanted to pursue, and by that time the pandemic was winding down and things were opening back up. So eventually there just wasn't any way for me to continue to work for Fontenelle Forest from 1,200 miles away. So what does that all have to do with this episode? Well, what you're about to hear is the episode that would have been the pilot episode of this podcast if Fontenelle Forest had opted to move forward with producing a podcast. It's the history of Fontenelle Forest, both as an organization, but also as a specific spot on the map. And even though I don't work for them anymore, Fontenelle Forest is one of my favorite places, and it's still an interesting story. So what follows is the original recording in its entirety. Now, keep in mind that it was my first attempt at podcasting. I mean, not that I'm a professional now or anything, but I was also working for and it was created for Fontenelle Forest. But one thing that remains the same, I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Hello and welcome to Dispatches from the Forest, the official podcast of Fontenelle Forest. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and for this, our very first episode, I want to introduce you to Fontenelle Forest, for those of you who may not be familiar with us. If you're not from the Omaha area or you've never visited Omaha, I'm here to tell you that Omaha is probably the most underrated big city in the country. My wife is in the Air Force, and when we first got orders to come to Omaha, we kind of rolled our eyes and we said, Omaha, really? But everyone we talked to who had been here said, no, you don't understand. Omaha is amazing. And they were absolutely correct. There's so much going on in Omaha. There's concerts, there's sporting events, there's great food. We have the Omaha Zoo, which is world class, botanical gardens, museums, and of course, Fontenelle Forest, which is one of my favorite places, and not just because I work there. So if you're listening and maybe you're a military family with orders to come here, or you have plans to pass through at some point in the future, because Omaha is on the way from point A to point B in a lot of cases, make plans to stop off and visit and see some of what Omaha has to offer. Now, today I want to talk to you about the history of Fontenelle Forest, not just as an organization, but also as a physical place. Because even if you're not a local, or you're a local and you've never come out to hike the trails or attend one of our many programs, the history of this area is not just interesting, it's important to understanding just what makes Fontenelle Forest so special. So what is Fontenelle Forest currently? Well, in a nutshell, or in our case, an acorn shell, Fontenelle Forest is a nonprofit nature center, and in fact, it's one of the oldest and largest privately owned nature centers in the country. We're located just south of Omaha, Nebraska, in Bellevue, Nebraska,
right along the Missouri River. And we have two properties. The main property, Fontenelle Forest itself, is just over 1,500 acres of oak woodlands and floodplain. And we have about 17 miles of hiking trails on that property, including about a mile of handicapped accessible boardwalk. Our second property, which is called Neal Woods, is located north of Omaha a little ways, also on the river or near the river. And Neal Woods encompasses about 550 acres of woodlands, wetlands, and tallgrass prairie restoration. And there we have about 7 more miles of hiking trails to be explored. In addition to offering opportunities to experience and enjoy the quiet wild of nature, which just so happens to be part of our mission statement, we offer a variety of programs, events, activities, and not just for kids, but all ages. We do have summer camps and kids programs, but we also offer adult programs like guided hikes and beer on the boardwalk. Now, before you tune out, I promise this is not just a 30-minute advertisement for Fontenelle Forest. I want to talk to you about the history of the area, because historically, well before the arrival of European settlers, this area was supporting populations of indigenous people. But to truly understand what made this area important, we have to go back thousands of years and look at the geology and the geography, because that's really where it all starts. So grab a snack. We're going to hop in the Wayback Machine. We're going to take a trip back to the end of the last ice age. So we're going back about 10,000 years. Now, I'm going to simplify a fairly complex process that had repeated itself several times over millions of years, but this was kind of the grand finale. The glaciers were retreating from the Great Plains, and in doing so, they were making a heck of a mess. So they were grinding rocks into dust, which is officially known as glacial till or glacial flour, which was carried away by meltwater and then deposited in various places. And then as it dried out, the wind did, even thousands of years ago, what the wind does now in the Great Plains, and that's blow like heck. So the wind was blowing, and it was blowing all this silt, all this glacial till eastward, and eventually depositing it in dunes along the Missouri River. And as time went on, these dunes grew up to about 200 feet tall in some cases. They were eventually stabilized by grass and then later trees. And this is what we call the Loess Hills. Loess, L-O-E-S-S, is a German word that means loose or crumbly. And the Loess Hills form a narrow band anywhere between 1 and 15 miles wide and 200 miles long, starting in South Dakota and going all the way down into Missouri along the Missouri River. And what makes them unique is that for hills of their size, they are nothing but dirt, hence the name loess or loose hills. Other hills are oftentimes formed by uplifting processes, so there's bedrock under there, but not in the Loess Hills. There's no underlying bedrock. It's all just dirt. Now, we're going to fast forward a few thousand years to the 1100s. Sometime between 1150 and 1290 AD, there were people who built their homes in these hills. And makes sense. Easy access to the river, abundant fish and game, fertile soil. These people were referred to as the Nebraska Phase culture, or the Nebraska Phase people. They were not nomads the way that later indigenous people would be, but they were hunters, they were gatherers, and they farmed the rich soil of the valley bottoms. They cultivated a lot of native plants. Now, at this time, the forest would not have been as dense as it is now. Historically, this was bur oak savanna, so scattered oak trees interspersed with grasses. And the oak savanna was one of the most common vegetation types in the Midwest back then, but today is highly endangered. Intact oak savannas are now one of the rarest plant communities on Earth. It was the later exclusion of fire that allowed other tree species to establish themselves, and restoring Fontenelle Forest to oak savanna is one of the primary goals of our land management team. But how do we know what we know about the Nebraska Phase people? Well, the Nebraska Phase people built earth lodges, and they left behind a lot of artifacts like pieces of pottery and bone tools. An earth lodge was constructed by first digging a large hole and then erecting 4 large central support beams. And these 4 main pillars supported a framework of rafters that were interwoven with smaller branches to form the roof and walls. An extended entryway usually faced south to take advantage of the warm sun in colder weather. The roof and walls were covered with wattle and daub, which is fancy words for grass and mud. A fire pit was located in the center of the lodge with a hole in the roof to let smoke escape, and storage pits were dug into the floor. And there are at least 70 known Earth Lodge sites in Fontenelle Forest and over 200 that have been identified in the greater Fontenelle Forest region. Interestingly, there's still a few mysteries that surround the Nebraska phase culture. One unknown is whether they lived individually or in villages. The lifespan of an Earth Lodge was about 7 years, and it seems like they burned them after that lifespan was over and built a new one. So Earth Lodge sites are sometimes found in small clusters, but it's not known whether that represents maybe a village or does that represent one group that was continually burning and rebuilding their lodges every 7 years. Another big unknown is what happened to the Nebraska Face people. It's kind of assumed that they assimilated into the Plains tribes later on, but that's not really known for sure. So let's fast forward again. We're going to the early 1800s. At this point, President Jefferson has just completed the Louisiana Purchase, and he's sending Lewis and Clark up the Missouri River to explore this newly acquired territory. On July 22, 1804, Lewis and Clark established what was called White Catfish Camp because somebody caught a white catfish in the river and spent 3 days on the shore of what is now Fontenelle Forest. In his journal, Clark wrote, "The wind blustering and hard from the south all day, which blew the clouds of sand in such a manner that I could not complete my plan. I was compelled to go into the woods and combat the mosquitoes," which, for anyone who lives in the Midwest, that sounds about right for a July day. In the 1820s, the fur trade was now booming, primarily for beaver, and the Missouri River Fur Company established a trading post on the river in 1822. This trading post was located within Fontenelle Forest, and we know this for a fact. We know the exact spot where it was located. The Nebraska Historical Society did an archaeological dig in the 70s and uncovered a lot of artifacts. In 1828, the trading post was purchased by a man named Lucian Fontenelle. Aha! A Fontenelle, but Fontenelle Forest is not named for Lucian, but rather for his oldest son, Logan. And here now to talk more about the Fontenelle family is Katherine Kuper. Katherine worked with the forest for 11 years and has been a volunteer for the past 4. And she works in the archives of Fontenelle Forest to preserve and organize our historical artifacts and information. Well, hi, Katherine. How are you today?
I'm good. It's a beautiful day here, so it's nice to be talking with you, Tim.
Oh, good. Well, thank you again for joining me. I've kind of gone through the history up to this point. I've kind of reached the point where Lucian Fontenelle showed up and purchased the trading post. But why don't you tell us a little more about the Fontenelle family?
The Fontenelle family are a very significant family, not only here in Fontenelle Forest, but in the surrounding area, the city of Omaha, and clearly the city of Bellevue. They enjoy a very distinct historical advantage. The history of the family really begins in New Orleans, where Lucian Fontenelle, the father, was born and raised. His parents were actually aristocrats from France, so he was well educated, and he had a sister. And up to the age of 12, he was going to a good school, so he was getting a good education. When he was 12, a hurricane hit New Orleans and killed his parents. So he and his sister were put into the custody of an aunt and were taken care of. And that's when he was 12. When he was a young teenager, that relationship and that setting did not go well for Lucian. So he left New Orleans and went to St. Louis. And of course, all the conversation in St. Louis was about going west. And for a young man, this was a real opportunity. So when he was a young man, he left St. Louis, started to work for the Missouri Fur Company. And he went up the river. He went all over the West. He was out in the Rockies. He was in Montana, but they weren't states at the time, but in that area.
Right.
And he was, of course, trapping, but also purchasing furs for the Missouri Fur Company. Eventually, he came back to this site along the river and decided to settle here. So it was about in about the 1820s to the 30s. There was one other trading post along the river, and then there was this trading post that was just a little north of Bellevue. And so he bought into it and operated it for the Missouri Fur Company for quite a number of years. While he was there, he married a young woman. She was the daughter of the chief of the Omaha tribe, Big Elk. Her name was Mumbane. I hesitate to say that because I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, but it's spelled Meumbaane.
Okay.
They had five children. And the oldest of those children was Logan, their oldest son. Now, another historic figure that some people might recognize is Father Pierre de Smet, a Jesuit missionary and explorer. And he would come up the river. He knew Lucien Fontenelle, and he officiated at the marriage of Mumbane and Lucien. And then over the years, on several trips, he baptized the children. So we have that other significant historical person. Just some things about the trading post that are worth noting. In the 1830s, two famous artists actually painted and sketched the trading post that was situated on the hillside up along the river. And those were Carl Bodmer, did that in 1833, and then George Catlin did it later in the 1830s somewhere. But that's significant because we have official documentation of the presence of that fort. The presence of that fort and those two paintings led to an archaeological excavation of the trading post in 1972 and 73. It was excavated by the Nebraska State Historical Society, and they spent 2 years. We have an extensive report of that. They, in fact, found the footings of the trading post, and they found a number of artifacts. We went down to the State Historical Society several years ago, and the woman who's the curator there I said, could we see some of these things? And she said, yes. She said there are 40 boxes.
Wow.
So, and she said 2 of those boxes are nails. So it gives you an idea of what was valuable at that trading post. But
Right.
There were a lot. So anyway, that's interesting. But the son, let's talk a little bit more about Logan, because Logan is indeed the namesake of Fontenelle Forest. He was, as we said, he was born here at the trading post. Well, he was actually born up north of Florence, and then when his father purchased the trading post, he moved down here. But Father de Smet, whom I mentioned earlier, found it important to train and to educate those 2 older boys. So he made it possible for Logan and his second brother, Albert, to go to St. Louis and get a Jesuit education there. And I think it would have been more in the caliber of high school education.
Okay.
But he spoke English. Logan spoke English. He spoke French. And he spoke a number of the Native American dialects. So that was a real talent and skill that he had. And of course, it led to his being hired by the federal government as an interpreter. His father died in 1840, and the trading post became an Indian agency purchased by the federal government. And that's when they hired Logan to be an English interpreter. He received a very good salary. And so that enabled him to live fairly comfortably here. He is probably very significant, most known for accompanying a group of Native Americans to Washington, D.C. For the sale of land to the federal government. That happened in 1854. And we see some notes or some indications that Logan was a chief. And that is not entirely accurate. He may have been a sub-chief, but he was not the chief.
Right.
As a matter of as a matter of fact, the official chief of the Omahas, Big Elk, appointed another man, Iron Eye, and he is the last chief of the Omaha tribe. Logan died in a skirmish with Sioux Indians out near Fremont, Nebraska. In 1855, he was only 30 years old. But if you read the report of his death and the funeral that followed, he was a respected man. He was well thought of. And that seems to be why the forest was named for him. Now, I don't know if you're interested in this, but I find it fascinating. This is speculation on my part as to why the name Fontenelle was chosen for the forest. When the group gathered originally to make this a nature center and to purchase land, it was originally called Child's Point Forest Association. That was the original name. But then it was changed to the Fontenelle Forest Reserve in 1913. And so the question is, why was there a change? Well, I have some thoughts about that. The name Fontenelle and the reference to Logan was very popular at that time. And this is one connection that I often think of. There was a gentleman on the founding board of Fontenelle Forest. His name was Thomas Kimball. Now, if you're from Omaha, you know that Thomas Kimball is a very famous Omaha architect in that period of time, in the early 1900s. He was the architect for some significant buildings in Omaha, for some significant houses, and anyway, he was on the board of Fontenelle Forest. Well, Thomas Kimball built a big hotel in downtown Omaha. It's since been torn down and replaced with something else. But the name of the hotel was Hotel Fontenelle. And he had a very large painting of what he imagined Fontenelle to be put up in that hotel. And so I sometimes wonder, did he influence the name of Fontenelle for the Child's Point Forest Association? I don't know if we'll ever know, but anyway, it's a very respectable name. The Fontenelle family is well respected in the area, and proud to have Logan Fontenelle as our namesake. I've kind of gone through that kind of quick. Tim, is there something else I can add or comment on?
No, I think that's great. It's a fascinating history. It really is, and I love hearing about it. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, kind of speaking of Child's Point, was the Union Pacific Railroad Bridge. I was reading about that, and it was originally built in 1872, which was just 5 years after Nebraska became a state. And one source called it one of the most strategically important railroad bridges in the United States. Now, that's currently located, the actual location is north of Fontenelle Forest, but that wasn't the original plan, was it?
No, it wasn't. And as a matter of fact, the original plan would have had that bridge located right here in Fontenelle Forest. And of course, if that were the case, Fontenelle Forest would not be here. If you know Omaha and know where that bridge is located, it is just east of the old market. If you think of the Durham Museum and the Burlington Northern train stations, it's right in that vicinity, and it crosses the river. at that location. Anyway, there was a man by the name of Charles Childs. He was an early settler here in the 1850s. He was one of the first, and he owned land that now is the property of Fontenelle Forest.
Right.
He had a sawmill there, and a sawmill along the river was a good thing in that time. He was transporting lumber into Omaha and Bellevue because those were growing cities for construction. But he was also using the waste lumber for steamboats along the river. And they would stop and take what he had. Just an added note here, at this time in history, in the 1850s and 60s, there was some tension, considerable tension, between the growing city of Omaha and the first historic community of Bellevue. So there was tension there. So anyway, what happens? There was an engineer working for the Union Pacific Railroad that I think most of you will recognize the name, General Grenville Dodge. Dodge Street in Omaha, the Dodge House in Council Bluffs, that's all in reference to General Grenville Dodge. He had done all of the preliminary work in terms of routing the Union Pacific Railroad, the transcontinental railroad that was coming from the east and would connect all the way to Sacramento, California. He had done surveys and he evaluated the property and the planned route, and it was determined that the best place for the bridge to cross the Missouri River would be at the location of Charles Childs' sawmill. The grade going up to cross the river was exceptional. It would have been far less expensive, and it would have been easier. There was no question about that. Now, Charles Childs was very pleased about this because he stood to make a lot of money. However, the meeting of the Board of Directors of the Union Pacific Railroad to decide the location was held in March of 1868. Now, several businessmen from Omaha got wind of this and assembled a group to go to the Union Pacific's board meeting, and at this time, the board was located in New York City. So they took along the governor of Nebraska at the time, Governor Alvin Saunders. So this was a high-powered delegation that went out to convince the Union Pacific to put the bridge in Omaha. Apparently, the group waited patiently outside the boardroom for a number of days. And then ultimately, General Dodge came out of the board meeting and informed the Omaha representatives that the Childs Mill location had been chosen as the most ideal, and that's where it would be. Well, you can imagine, this rather upset this contingent from Omaha, and they insisted on speaking to the board, and they did. And they made several offers to the Union Pacific in terms of land and money. And the board did reverse its decision and chose Omaha. And so today, that's where the bridge is located. This was very bad news for Charles Childs, as it was a big financial loss for him. But it was good news for an organization that would later be called Fontenelle Forest, and that would not come into existence until 1913, and that would purchase this land from Charles Childs in 1920. We're just celebrating, we're 1 year after the big celebration of that purchase of land in 1920. So the next time you come to the forest, Tim, or anybody else, walk along the hills and be glad that it is what it is, and that it's not the railroad yards of the Union Pacific,
Right.
which is a little further north of us. So we're grateful for that.
Yeah, looking back, I think we are. We're very fortunate that Omaha was insistent on getting that bridge.
Yes.
Continuing on our journey through time, we arrive in the year 1910. Now, at this point in time, some of the who's who of the Omaha area had the idea to preserve Fontenelle Forest. If you can imagine that these folks had moved from the east, where trees were abundant, to the Great Plains, where trees were very scarce, this forest along the Missouri River probably reminded them a bit of back home. A college professor by the name of A. Taylor proposed that Nebraska, which was now just over 40 years old as a state, turn this area into a state park. In an address to the Nebraska Conservation and State Development Congress, he stated, "Nebraska has but a scanty supply of natural timber. It becomes us to conserve and handle intelligently what we have. By far the largest and most varied tract of timber lies along the Missouri River in Sarpy County. It should be managed according to scientific principles for profit, and it has large educational value as well. It would be a great state park, a place where recreation of the most elevating sort might be sought. Birds, animals, and plants would be preserved and protected." Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, in 1911, the legislature declined to even give the idea a hearing. But even though the attempt to create a state park failed, the idea of preserving these woods did not. Those interested in this preservation decided instead to manage the area as a private park, and in 1913, they created the Fontenelle Nature Association. The state charter listed their purpose as securing and developing for the education of the public lands lying along the Missouri River in Douglas and Sarpy County. And that's still education, largely what Fontenelle Forest is about today. 1913 wasn't a great time to fundraise for a private park. The First World War was just around the corner and would start just a year later. However, in 1916, Dr. Harold Gifford, a local eye doctor, purchased the very first 200-acre plot for $55,000. Now, to give you an idea of the magnitude of that gesture, today that would be over $716,000. He would sell this land back to the Fontenelle Nature Association 3 years later in 1920 for $7,500, and he considered the difference, $47,500, to be a donation. Again, in today's dollars, that donation, that $47,500, would be worth about $618,000. Over the years, Fontenelle Forest has continued to acquire land whenever they could, either by purchasing it or having it donated. And as recently as just a few years ago, the Boy Scouts sold us what is called Camp Wakanda, which was a property that adjoined the east side of the main Fontenelle Forest property. That initial 200-acre purchase has now grown to over 1,500 acres. And as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, Fontenelle Forest owns a second property, Neil Woods, and that was donated to the forest in 1971. Adjoining properties have also been purchased or donated, which have allowed this area to swell to about 550 acres. Now, no history of Fontenelle Forest would be complete without talking about some of the other characters that have contributed to both the history or the mythology. Robert Gilder was instrumental in discovering artifacts from the Nebraska phase culture. Gilder retired from the Omaha World Herald in 1919 to pursue his two favorite hobbies, landscape painting and amateur archaeology. Gilder owned a cabin near the forest that was called Wake Robin, which is now the name of an elementary school in the area. And he was one of the first to excavate the mysterious depressions in the forest and identify them as Earth Lodge sites. But when it comes to characters, Jim Baldwin, also known as the Hermit of Fontenelle Forest, is by far the most interesting. And I'm going to let Katherine tell us more about Jim Baldwin. Well, the last thing I want to ask you about is one of the legendary characters of Fontenelle Forest that kind of, when we talk about the forest, we talk about Jim Baldwin, the Hermit of Fontenelle Forest. And he lived on land adjacent to the forest starting around the 1940s. Do I have that right?
A little more than 1930s, I think.
Oh, okay. And I know that he was kind of a legendary figure. Can you tell us more about Jim Baldwin?
Jim is still a legendary figure. We still hear people talking about the Hermit of Fontenelle Forest and Jim Baldwin. And he is indeed, was he real? Some people say it's just a myth. But in fact, he was a real person. Was he scary? Well, not exactly from the stories and the reports that we have. He was a very gentle, interesting man who lived off the land. Um, he was quite a character, and his name lives on a long time after him. The location of his land was, as you said, adjacent to the forest, and it was. It's south. It's on the southern edge of the forest right now. It's along History Trail, if some of you have walked here, and it's not far at all from the Boy Scout Camp Wakanda that the forest recently acquired. It overlooks the Great Marsh. It's up on the ridge there. Now, let me tell you what we know about Jim. Jim was a soldier in World War I and may have suffered from PTSD. There are several reports of indications that he suffered from effects of being in World War I. He returned to Bellevue after the war and lived with his father, who I might add was an interesting character as well, and his two brothers in the woods and off the land for quite a number of years. They had a two-story type dwelling built out on the ridge, and later that fell apart, and Jim built some huts and even lived in a dugout cave there. His father and his brothers eventually left after several years, but Jim stayed on, and he was a rather shy person. He didn't like to be out in the public too much, but he kind of grew to like that contact with people, and he loved to tell stories. That became quite apparent. In later years, Jim lived, the family owned about 90 acres, so it was a pretty good-sized piece of property. In later years, in the 1940s, Jim began to have contact with Boy Scouts who were attending camp down at Camp Gifford, and with Girl Scouts who were doing summer camp over at Camp Brewster, which is a little north of the Nature Center. So those groups would be wandering through the woods, and he would play the role of this hermit very persuasively, and he seemed to enjoy it as well. Stories are told of the Boy Scouts wandering along the trail in the vicinity of his dwelling, and they would call out, "Hermit Jim! Hermit Jim!" And then all of a sudden Jim would appear from behind a tree. He was a tall man with a long beard and a long, shaggy hair. And of course, he heard them coming. He knew they were coming. He was often barefoot with well-worn clothing. So he's quite a character. And then he always seemed to be a rather gentle man. No one has described him as scary, but he was mysterious, and I think that was intriguing. He always had great stories to tell, and he loved telling the stories. His favorite story was the story of the hoop snake, and we have quite a number of newspaper articles in our archives here at Fontenelle Forest, and the reference to the hoop snake stories is frequent. And this is the story. This is how it goes. Apparently, one day, Jim came upon a snake who was escaping a predator. Jim says he watched, sat behind a tree, and he watched as the snake began to swallow his own tail and all of the rest of him until there was hardly any part of the snake visible. Jim says that he sat there for a while and watched. When the coast was clear, no more predator, the snake would slither out of his own mouth and slip away. Now, if you were 8 or 9 or 10 years old, what would you think? Sounds like a believable story, especially coming from Hermit Jim. I'm sure that story lingered in people's minds for a long time, and that is evidenced by the newspaper articles that we have and the frequent reference to the story about the hoop snake.
Sure. And as a former Boy Scout myself, I've been on a snipe hunt, which is kind of the same thing.
Okay.
You stand out in the woods with a flashlight and a sack and
try to get the snipe to come in?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you still remember the story.
That's right.
And Jim's life actually changed in 1959, when two boys who thought he had some money stashed out at his site attacked him and beat him up. He was able to get some help and ended up in the hospital. Jim lost his right eye over this incident. He stayed at the veterans home after being dismissed from the hospital for about a month, and then he was ready to return to his dwelling. And this, again, is quite a story. Apparently, they had they had a small parade when Jim was ready to return to the forest with a small band, and the mayor was there, and this is all in Bellevue, and he was transported to the edge of the forest by limousine. And the story goes that Jim kept talking to the kids who were gathered, the scouts who were gathered, and they had a tough time getting him into the limousine, getting moving to the forest. He was then airlifted by helicopter from off at Air Force Base into the woods. So it was quite an event. We have a lot of newspaper clippings about those events, so it must have been very newsworthy.
That's awesome.
It is. And even when I was doing senior programs here at the forest, there would be people who remember that event of Jim being returned to the forest. He really was not able to survive very well. He lasted about 3 months, and then was discovered by some friends, and he just was not able to take care of himself in the forest. So he went to live with his sister until he died in 1966 at age 78. His land was later purchased by Fontenelle Forest and became part of the forest. If you walk along History Trail, you will still find evidence of Jim's life out there at that time. There are some metal pieces that are fairly large that may have been part of a house or something like that, but they exist there. There's also some iris that were planted, I understand, by his sister. So it's clear that somebody lived there.
I was going to say, I think if you walk the history trail, you can get a guide from the front desk, and there's markers out there to the Fontenelle family. There's the evidence of the trading post and of the earth lodges, and evidence of Jim Baldwin's dwellings there too.
That's correct. That's correct. So anyway, the story of Jim is a great, long-lasting story. We're talking about it today. It's the story of a gentleman, though, full of mystery, and a man who lived successfully off the land. When you think of it, he would have been able to fish from the river. He had a small farm where he grew crops. He could hunt in the forest. I mean, it was an ideal location.
Sure.
There are many stories about Jim, and ones we're proud to tell about this most recent and notorious inhabitant of Fontenelle Forest.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us today, Katherine. I really appreciate you doing this for me.
You're welcome. Glad to, the stories of and the history of Fontenelle Forest are rich in so many ways, and so I'm always glad to talk about anything to do with the forest and its history, the wonderful history.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Katherine. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Well, that wraps up our very first episode of Dispatches from the Forest. Again, I want to thank Katherine Kuper for sharing her knowledge with us, and thank you for joining me today on what I hope is the very first step on a journey of 1,000 miles. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this lost episode and learning all about Fontenelle Forest. It's a place that will always have a special place in my heart. If you want to support the podcast, this one here that was launched by the one you just heard, there's several ways you can do that. You could, for instance, become a patron. Go check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. You could also, if you felt so inclined, make a one-time donation, either through the Cash App using the hashtag ForestNerd, or using PayPal using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, which is the very same email address you could use to contact me if you have, say, a question or a comment or a suggestion for future episodes. Or anything else you might want to contact me for. You can also get some Dispatches from the Forest merch. Check out all the offerings at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest. Finally, you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Again, happy holidays and happy new year, my feral friends. See you in 2025. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.